the Bitcoin journey is deeply, deeply individual. It's deeply personal. So it's like you and, books, podcasts, content in general that you consume. Started my Bitcoin journey in 2017, and I ride those waves and adoption cycles all the way to 2025 or mid 2025 where we are today. I've never been more bullish on Bitcoin. If you ask somebody new to Bitcoin today about Bitcoin talk, I would pretty confidently say that a majority of newcomers to Bitcoin today have never typed bitcointalk.org in their browser ever. The monetary properties, the predictable issuance, the cap, and how Bitcoin is a savings technology, it's going to be life-changing. And I think the same thing when you scale up to TradFi, legacy finance, just the fact that they integrate Bitcoin is going to make their services so much better and more efficient. So
before we get started with all the topics, maybe give us some quick overview of who you are and why you're excited about Bitcoin.
I'm Fernando. I'm the VP of Marketing and Communications at Blockstream, and I'm also the founder of Perception, which is, majority of people will probably know Blockstream. It's the global leader in Bitcoin and blockchain infrastructure. CEO Adam Back, legend in the game, been around. Blockstream's been around since 2014, and we're kind of like building the infrastructure for Bitcoin. Bitcoin Perception is the data intelligence platform that I founded last year. Essentially what it does is just gathers data from 100 plus sources in terms of how Bitcoin, stablecoin, tokenized finance, those type of things are being covered in the mainstream media, in legacy media, crypto media, but also Reddit, Stacker News, Twitter, and X, and 100 plus sources. And I take all of that data and have a trend discovery service and also sentiment analysis on whether certain topics, how they are being covered, and whether these things are covered in a negative or a positive way. I'm originally from Argentina, so back in 2017 when a friend of mine introduced me to Bitcoin, I already knew about what inflation means. I grew up in Norway when I was a kid. My mom emigrated from Argentina when I was 5 years old because of a hyperinflationary dumpster fire that happened in Argentina in 1989. Every time when I went back to see my family, because my dad and the rest of my family was in Argentina, inflation was always a topic of conversation again and again. So as a young student, I try to understand what is this inflation thing that people are talking about, and why aren't we learning about this in school? That led me through just reading books on my own, learning about gold, learning about Milton Friedman and all the classic Austrians. So by the time Bitcoin came to my door in 2017 through my friend, I kind of understood the monetary properties of Bitcoin, and that was the initial thing. And kind of like the thing that still gets me excited about Bitcoin are the monetary properties. So that's my background. I also before Blockstream, I started my career in the music business. In Norway, I was a country manager for Universal Music Group, and I was in the middle of kind of like the craziness around the Pirate Bay, if you remember that. Torrenting, streaming was the thing that was very disruptive to the music business, and I really wanted to get on top of that. But I was too young to have enough influence in the boardrooms. So eventually, I kind of got frustrated with the music business and quit. But I feel like my career has always been, close to disruptive technologies, and I think Bitcoin is kind of like doing the same for legacy finance, traditional banking, and it's really exciting to be close to the action working at Blockstream. So that's TLDR on me.
That's awesome. And we talked about before that we kind of want to talk about the narrative wars. And I think that topic is so interesting because I often describe ourselves like people that educate in the Bitcoin space. And there's actually from people like Robert Breedlove, Michael Saylor, like the biggest ones in the space, till like someone that just talks to their mother and Orange Pill is like one person. I think we all are digital or offline soldiers in kind of this Bitcoin narrative warfare. What do you kind of see in how the narrative is shaping in Bitcoin? And I want to get into something a little bit later after that with internal and external wars in the narrative war, because I think we have a lot of narrative fightings internally in Bitcoin, but then like as a Bitcoin community outside to like 99.9% to the other people that aren't in the Bitcoin community yet.
That's super interesting. I'm super happy that you want to bring that up as well. So we got a lot of stuff to go through. But yeah, I think just on a high level, my my personal understanding is, looking around at where we are right now, it's obvious that we can all feel that Bitcoin is now at a pivotal moment when it comes to its adoption cycle. We're kind of like moving from the fringes of finance to the center of global economic narratives. And I think that as Bitcoin is maturing, it is maturing and kind of like entering this new stage at the very moment where the media landscape is totally fragmenting. So I think it's super interesting because what once operated as like centralized gatekeepers of public opinion is now splintered into countless platforms, and each of those platforms has its own agenda, bias, narrative slant, and then within each platforms is all the outlets and all the influencers who also have their own agenda, their own bias, their own narrative slant. So I think exploring how these shifts are shaping how the world sees Bitcoin is super interesting. And it's also interesting to see why some narratives are gaining traction and then why other narratives are kind of like getting buried. And then how the dynamics of this fragmentation could affect Bitcoin adoption in the years ahead. Because I do think that we all have our own personal orange pilling story. I personally think that the journey, the Bitcoin journey, is deeply, deeply individual. It's deeply personal. So it's like you and books, podcasts, content in general that you consume, and then try to like get your own understanding of, right? And the people who are talking to you in that process. I mean, the podcasters that you're choosing to listen to, the books, the authors that you're choosing to read books from, they are all part of that journey. And it's a very like one-on-one communication, and you just like choose your influencers, your authors, your podcasters very carefully. And then you kind of like stick around and you listen to more episodes or more content or read more books from the same authors. And that shapes your worldview. Now, somebody else also interested in Bitcoin who have listened to completely different sets of authors, podcasters, and influencers might also like Bitcoin, but for completely different reasons than your own. And then, when you are then orange pilled, and as it's very common, once you understand Bitcoin, you will kind of want to go to the top of the mountain and just shout it out, right? You now want to orange peel other people, and you are now becoming the influencer. Then that's just a cycle that just scales a lot. And I think you now have influencers that are Bitcoin influencers, but there's a cohort that only cares about the technical side of things. Then there's another cohort that only cares about the energy, the environmental. And then there's another side that is only about regulatory policies and like the politics of Bitcoin. And then it's only the straight up number go up ETF, more financial side. And this goes from influencers to media outlets to TV channels to everything. It's all fragmented in these little sections. So I feel like it's an interesting time to be alive because this fragmentation is kind of like here to stay. And I think the next generation of new Bitcoiners that will understand Bitcoin and be Bitcoiners, I don't even know what that term means anymore. They will just come in and purely understand Bitcoin from one perspective, and then a whole other gang of group will understand Bitcoin from one perspective, and then the total of all those splintered segments will be the Bitcoin community, but they're going to be very different from each other, and that might also, turn into more narrative wars and people disagreeing because they kind of like defend their own factions, they defend their own beliefs, and it's kind of like hard to move away from that established belief. So, yeah. Very interesting topic. What do you think about what I just said? Is this somewhat aligned to what you think?
It's super interesting because I've talked with almost 500. I think we have today 493. So we're almost at 500 different guests. Wow. And there are many different angles you can tackle Bitcoin. There is as you said, the economical. So like, there's like two very broad groups for like the more technical people that are really interested in the technology, in mining, in the sovereignty of it, and the peer-to-peer aspect of it. And then there are people on the other side that are just really interested in number graph technology and the store of value. They often only have Bitcoin on ETFs or like just a part of it in self-custody or maybe some on exchange, stuff like that. And they're also more prone to buying MicroStrategy and buying derivative of Bitcoin that might give them a leverage or a yield on top of Bitcoin. And then there is in those groups many different subgroups, and you described it so wonderful. And it's one thing I've noticed that there's not a one size fits all solutions. When it comes to orange pilling, when it comes to narratives, when it comes to anything of that, because every person is differently. So for one person, they are listening to Michael Seyr and they're like, oh shit, like he's so great. They're like, I now get Bitcoin. Yeah. Another person cannot even listen to him, and they are listening to Peter Dodd or someone more technically browned, and they're like, oh, like now I get what Bitcoin actually is, because we have different perspectives and different angles, and we're coming from a different background, and we're needing those different properties of ourselves reflected in the story that we are being told. And I think one thing we also touched on before we started recording is the decentralization of media houses. So like if you look back 20, 30 years, it was a very different landscape. Now, people like me that, I'm just alone with 2 freelancers that help me part-time a little bit. And they all of a sudden have a voice and have sometimes hundreds of thousands of listeners each month. So this is really big, this shift to individual smaller creators that all of a sudden have a pretty big voice and can be taken seriously. I remember, and I always bring that example up, the early days of my Twitter journey was really cool because when I hit 300, 400 subscribers, a local newspaper reached out because one tweet got viral, and they covered me with like a whole page in their economy side. And this was a nice article actually about Bitcoin, which I didn't expect at all. So there's just like, you now have the possibility to be a random pleb, write one tweet, a journalist sees it, and they actually contact you and want to make a small article around that story that you tell. So it's just amazing the possibilities we have and how that impacts Bitcoin it's mind blowing for me.
Yeah, and this is something that has happened inside Bitcoin as well, right? Like in the first few years of Bitcoin, I mean, it was super centralized, the communication. It was Bitcoin talk. And then if you ask somebody new to Bitcoin today about Bitcoin talk, I would pretty confidently say that a majority of newcomers to Bitcoin today have never typed bitcointalk.org in their browser ever. And from that beginning, then it started to spread out to Reddit, then to Bitcoin Twitter. And now we have, even more stuff like Nostr and so many other like French communities within the Bitcoin community. And then you have all the other non-Bitcoin outlets that have started to cover Bitcoin as well. And if you log into to the perception platform, bitcoinperception.com, and you start to look at just the volume, you'll see that in the very beginning, like my platform goes all the way back to 2011, and it's just like a flat line. It's just like barely. And then you see the Bitcoin price. You can, in my platform, you can compare the Bitcoin price with the volume and the coverage from all these sources that I'm tracking. And it's just like the Bitcoin price helped the story, and more outlets starting to pick up on that just purely by price. So, the meme of like, you come for the NGU, but you stay for the revolution is totally real, because this is the story about Bitcoin that just keeps people coming back. And then, if you heard a story about, oh, Bitcoin crashed 35%, you'll have a negative understanding of Bitcoin. But then a year later, you see another story with Bitcoin just like, up 230%. And that might give you another chance to look at Bitcoin again. So it's like more of that decentralization has happened as the price has gone up, and more outlets have started to cover Bitcoin as a result of that. And then depending on the outlet that these people like what their ideology are, or their own beliefs are, the kind of reporters that they employ, their coverage will be a reflection of that. So you will see that the BBC has also picked up and started covering Bitcoin at a very specific time when Bitcoin passed a certain price point. But their coverage has been extremely negative and almost exclusively negative since the very beginning. And even in 2025 today, their coverage is like insanely negative. I just did a Q1 report on bitcoinperception.com, because I also do some research reports for my newsletter. And in Q1 of this year, in 2025, BBC had 40% negative coverage and 0 positive in January, February, and March of this year. You would think that Bitcoin has proven itself at this point, right? 16 years of uptime. Price is just, is the best performing asset of the last decade, et cetera, et cetera. You would think they would at least consider another angle, but they don't. So this is also something about the fragmentation that we're seeing, is that a lot of new players or new outlets might start to cover Bitcoin, but they have an agenda, and their agenda is their bias. Their bias is the reason that they have accumulated an audience to begin with, because their stories, their angles, their narratives attract a certain type of people, so that when you get big enough, it's kind of like audience capture. Like when you get big enough, you need to keep telling these stories in order to keep that audience and maybe attract more of that audience that think the same. So at this point, there are certain media outlets who can't ever publicly change their mind about Bitcoin, because that would mean they will lose the audience or the readers or whatever that they have. But then what's interesting is that there are other outlets that are not that desperate, I would say, who have the luxury or the privilege to actually change their mind a little bit and start covering Bitcoin a little bit differently. And I see that with the financial outlets like Bloomberg, Forbes, CNBC, stuff like that. Now, the interesting thing about those outlets is, okay, maybe they have a bad history. Like if you look at their Bitcoin stories from 2016 or whatever, they're almost exclusively negative. And then, once the ETF got approved and, Larry Fink from BlackRock all of a sudden became a Bitcoin proponent, they started to change their tune as well. And Larry Fink also, right? Like he used to be negative about Bitcoin, and then he became positive and started publicly, doing the 180, saying that, okay, now Bitcoin is good in my opinion. And these are people who have the luxury to pivot and to capture a new audience, and maybe not think about, like, let's say in Larry Fink's position, maybe they have a lot of like old school investors, or just like investors who are like anti-Bitcoin, but they have enough volume, they have enough size to be like, hey, we can take this pivot and attract an audience who is pro-Bitcoin. And then if these anti-Bitcoiners who are part of our client list, for example, chooses to leave BlackRock, okay, fine, we can deal with that. The upside, the potential upside, is bigger than whatever downside is. But for the BBC, for the Guardian, for these outlets who are really struggling, they can't afford that. They need to keep whatever little audience that they have left. So that's why these narratives will never change, and we should expect that and not be like, oh man, BBC again. No, it's like you need to understand that these people will never change their point of view because there's a deeper motivation behind it. And then the Bloombergs, the Forbes, the CNBCs of the world who are now switching and covering Bitcoin positively, you need to be okay with the fact that they will only talk about Bitcoin in the terms of NGU and ETF inflows and stuff like that, that maybe to you as a Bitcoiner is not Bitcoin enough. But we need to be acceptive of the fact that there will be fragments, there will be factions of the fragmented media landscape who will cover Bitcoin positively, but from a very narrow perspective. And it's a narrow perspective because that's how they understand the world, right? Like if you take a look at yourself, and sorry for this rant, but I have so many opinions about this. Feel free to just stop me if I go too long. But on an individual level, we are busy people. We got families, we got jobs, we got friends, we got a lot of stuff to do in the 16 hours a day that we are awake. So we can't really spend every single day learning new things and seeing things from 1,000 perspectives to get a nuanced understanding of one topic, right? You do that with one topic, and then you have to realize you need to do this with 50, 60 topics. Your brain will explode, right? So us humans, we go into this like defense mechanism or like a survival instinct type of thing, where we understand a few concepts enough for it makes sense to us. And then the combination of these like very simple, very narrow understandings of life is the lens that we will see life through, that is making us able to live our life, take care of our family, have a job, build a career, whatever you want to do, without going insane. Because there's just too much information, there's too much things to consider that you just can't. So you just have to pick your side, pick your thought leaders, your influencers, and just develop a very simple understanding of complex things, at least to have some understanding of something. And that is kind of like what these outlets are doing, right? So Bloomberg will be financial, and that's their lens that they will cover Bitcoin through. And we need to be cool with that. We can't be, as Bitcoiners who've been in the game for a while, we can't say, oh, no, this is not how you're supposed to cover Bitcoin, or this is not how you're supposed to use Bitcoin. No, this is the real Bitcoin. This is the fake Bitcoin. And I think this is something that one of my biggest problems with the Bitcoin community is that we have all these preconceived notions of what Bitcoin is and what Bitcoin is not. And just because somebody else thinks differently about your beloved Bitcoin doesn't mean that they're wrong. They're just not aligned with your point of view, and that's okay. And I think we need to be okay with these things as Bitcoin continues to grow and adoption continues to grow.
That is such a great point, because I'm actually quite annoyed by that because I think Bitcoin is a mirror, and we portray our own values onto Bitcoin and expect everyone else also to have those values. One very popular example is diet. There are raw vegans in the Bitcoin community, and there are raw carnivore people that eat like one meal a day, one steak a day, and they both love Bitcoin, and they both completely are on a very different perspective on where diet is. And I see it a lot, like the Bitcoiner has to eat meat, the Bitcoiner like. That's just not true. And you also said before, like it's hard to put a label on a Bitcoiner and actually go ahead and always label a Bitcoiner the same way. A Bitcoiner is someone who has Bitcoin or uses Bitcoin. Like that's it. All the other things is because we are humans, and we put it on there, and but it's not true. Like a Bitcoin is just someone that has or uses Bitcoin. I mean, we can even get it down to uses Bitcoin, because if you just hold it, it's also a use case for me. So Bitcoin is just someone that uses Bitcoin and nothing else. Everything else is just a narrative that we spin in our head, even though I know there is, and there, that might also be interesting. There's this, how is it called, Myers personality tests, and they have done it with the general population and with Bitcoiners. I think like 3,000 or 4,000 Bitcoiners or something like that participated in, and it's completely different. So those who in the general population aren't as common are very common in the Bitcoiner sphere. So there is a certain personality type in Bitcoin, but that doesn't mean that there are only those, and it also doesn't mean that you have your values and then all of the other ones also have to behave the same way. It's ridiculous for me.
Yeah, no, it is, and I think it the fact that these like stereotypes are still like clear in your mind and you can kind of like define it very well today goes to show how early we really are, right? Like if Bitcoin was way bigger than it already is, it would have so many different people involved that all of these things would be blurred and not really that clear or not easy to define. But the fact that it is easy to define for you to, for example, break it down, the stereotypes in terms of diet, that means we're still early. This is still a very small fraction of the global population in terms of like adoption, right? That we are still able to draw, almost like caricatures of different Bitcoiners, stereotypical behaviors, which is, I guess it's good, right? Because if you want to get into Bitcoin, you want to get in as early as possible. So it's just another affirmation of how early we are in the entire adoption process in terms of having Bitcoin become a global asset. But I do think that, hey, in the very beginning, you are very susceptible to new information, and there's a period in the first touch points in your Bitcoin journey where you are very open for a lot of different information, because at some point in the very beginning, when you start to like get into Bitcoin, you start to learn so many different things. And you start like realizing like, holy man, like there's a lot of stuff that I thought about the world that my worldview is kind of like getting crushed by the minute here. So you start asking questions about other things as well, right? Like when you start realizing that you haven't really been taught about money in the public school system, you start asking, okay, what else haven't I been taught about? And you start to like distrust a lot of the previous narratives that you used to believe in, and you kind of like get into this cognitive vacuum where the old narratives that you used to believe in, that was fed to you as a child, you realize now that it's not as valid anymore. But at the same time, we are humans, and narratives is what drive us to make decisions, to move certain places, to make all the hundreds plus decisions that we have to make every day, right? So there's a vacuum of like old narratives. I understand it's a lot of stuff that I need to replace. But then what do I replace it with? So this vacuum becomes this like vulnerable state, I would say, where you might be convinced about Bitcoin's monetary properties by an influencer who also happens to be a carnivore. And then you're like, let me check out the carnivore stuff. And then, these things snowballs. And that's the power of influencers, right? Because they get you through the door through one thing, but then they might have other things that they're interested about, right? Seyr Amus, one of, sold, over 1 million copies sold of the Bitcoin Standard. A lot of people understood Bitcoin through that book alone. But then you start checking out Seyfedin's Twitter, and he's, carnivore, and there's a lot of other stuff that is non-Bitcoin related that he also keeps talking about. And you're like, okay, maybe he has a point about this because he made a point about Bitcoin that I believe in. So that's where I think personally, this is something that I had to learn, myself. I had to take myself out of that and say, listen, okay, things are going a little bit too crazy. You're starting to believe other things that are non-Bitcoin by these other Bitcoiners. And you need to you really need to be super critical to that new information flow, because just because they're right about Bitcoin doesn't mean they're right about everything else. And I think that is very hard to do in the beginning when you have this vacuum, like I said, and you want to think differently, you want to see the world differently because Bitcoin has taught you so much. But there's a very, I don't want to say dangerous, but yeah, it could potentially be dangerous if your body can't process eating meat for 30 straight days. Then maybe it could be a dangerous thing to do. So yeah, I think it's easy to get carried away when it comes to Bitcoin, because you have a lot of smart people saying a lot of smart things, and but I think it's it's your own responsibility to create that filter and to be critical of new information that these influencers or these outlets are giving you, and not given the benefit of the doubt just because they convince you about one thing, which is Bitcoin. Does that make sense?
Let's take a break for a moment and appreciate the beauty that Coin Vigilante has made with the Bitcoin watches. Those watches are the most amazing, the most elegant way of showing that you are a true Bitcoiner. And Coin Vigilante just dropped a completely new and amazing Genesis edition of their watch collections. You have the date of the first ever mined Bitcoin block in there, and of course also the block height and which epoch we are currently in. I love the level of detail they put in this masterpiece. Make sure to check out those amazing Coin Vigilante timepieces down in the descriptions. I love those watches so much. And now if you have Bitcoin, I really do hope that you don't have it on exchange. But if you do have it on exchange, I have two ways for you to deal with that. The first way is you put it on a hardware wallet. That's the entry for you to get into the self-custody game. I recommend BitBox, Bitcoin only edition, for that. It's a super simple and secure way. And if you check out the link in the description, you even get 5% off if you use the code Robin. And the second way is the Bitcoin Way. The Bitcoin Way is your all-in partner in terms of how to get the most out of your sovereignty. They will personalize for you a self-custody setup that is perfect for your individual situation. They will show you how you can secure your own devices. Securing your Bitcoin is not enough. You also have to keep all your devices secure. One topic that is overlooked often is the inheritance plan. What happens with your Bitcoin once you are no longer here? Do you have a plan for that in place already? And last but not least, if you're in the jurisdictions where you don't feel safe, it's better to get a plan B. For all that, head over to thebitcoinway.com/Robin to get a 30-minute free call. And just a quick side note, I will be for the first time ever speaking at the Bitcoin Prague event in June. It will be absolutely legendary and I'm really looking forward to seeing all of you there. You can get your ticket in the link down in the description of Bitcoin Prague, and very important, use code Robin to get 10% off your ticket. I'm really looking forward seeing you there. Yeah, like Bitcoin is kind of an interesting intelligence test, but it's not 100% quote. It's like, and you can still, so just because someone is good in discovering Bitcoin doesn't mean he's also good in all other aspects of life. The same way as maybe a doctor is really good in saving lives, but he maybe doesn't understand Bitcoin. Yeah. So I think those skills don't transfer automatically, which is an interesting point. How do you think as we are still a very small and early group, and as we before said, we can still do some kind of characteristics of what like the average Bitcoiner currently kind of looks, even though it's not 100%, but like if we go with tendencies, how do you think the general population will look to Bitcoiners that bought Bitcoin before 2026 in like 10, 20 years? And look back, I think like there's now an shape of like real estate people that got like real estate for like free blueberries in 1950 and stuff like that. How do you think the general population will look at those early Bitcoiners?
I think my my biggest wish is that they don't take a look, and they just because I think it's kind of cringe. I think that. And this is maybe because the op return debates is so fresh and it's happening right now, and I am totally cringed out by the way these debates or discussion has happened. But I think that it all depends on where Bitcoin is in 10 years from now, because if Bitcoin succeeds, all of us will be looked at pioneers. If Bitcoin doesn't succeed, we're going to be cast as naive ideologists who didn't know about the real world. So it all depends on how this thing eventually ends up being. But I think Bitcoin is going to win. I think Bitcoin is going to just continue to grow. But that's also, I'm confident, and I'm saying this with all the information that we have up until today. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. I might change my mind about Bitcoin. But ever since I started my Bitcoin journey in 2017, and I ride those waves and adoption cycles all the way to 2025 or mid 2025, where we are today, I've never been more bullish on Bitcoin. And I really see, like, you know, from my understanding of Bitcoin, which is the monetary properties, the predictable issuance, the cap, and how Bitcoin is a savings technology, and how savings technology is the catalyst for so many improvements in life. That's not just because of Bitcoin, because of the catalyst that Bitcoin represents in order for people who are poor, who are forced to live day to day, are now available. They have now the possibility to plan ahead more than one day in the future. Just those things is extremely transformational, and I don't think people realize the extent of how much that changes your whole perspective, how much that changes your life. We're talking about stuff like you can now earn money digitally, and the hardest money ever created, and you can be paid by anybody around the world, which means that you now have an appreciating asset that you can save in and plan for the future, but you don't have to leave your country or your family to go work in another country in order to get paid. So that is just insane. If that had existed back in 1989, when my mom had to make that choice, if Bitcoin existed at that time, we would have never left Argentina, and Argentina would be more prosperous than it is today. This is just one example that I'm giving you. Take that example and then extrapolate that into 1,000x across the entire world, and just that is insane. Okay. And if things don't get drastically changed when it comes to the protocol, to the consensus, to Bitcoin itself, then yeah, I truly believe we are going to be seen as visionaries. As we were all playing a part in Bitcoin's success, and the world is a better place because of that in 2035. If things drastically change and all of a sudden, I don't know, there's a consensus around not having 21 million as the cap, then I'm going to stop believing Bitcoin, and I think people looking back will look at us as fools. So Yeah, I don't know if this is a good question, but it was a really good question that you're posing, though. It's a very interesting thought experiment.
Do you see indicators from all those medias and narratives that you're seeing for the Bitcoin adoption going forward, or is it like a leading or like more of a lagging indicator of like, okay, there's Bitcoin adoption happening and that's why media is kind of reporting on it? Or is it maybe even the other way around where there's a small media coverage and then this actually drives more adoption?
Yeah, that's the whole reason I created the Bitcoin perception platform, because there's a big difference between what is being discussed in Stacker News, on Reddit, on X, just take a few of the channels that I'm sourcing, versus what is being covered in the legacy media. Two scenarios within that gap is the things that gets discussed on Reddit, Stacker News, X, whatever, never makes it to the legacy media. They're just not covering it. Nobody will know. It's just a fringe topic that stays within the community of people who are more in tune with what's happening at Bitcoin on a daily basis. But then the stuff that do get covered in the legacy media obviously comes way later than when it first started, being discussed in like the base layer, I would say, of the Bitcoin discussion, which is the people, which is the different players, which are the different founders of different companies and power users and influencers. That conversation is where it starts. And obviously, in the middle, you have crypto media, you have the Cointelegraphs, the CoinDesk, and stuff like that, who constantly are looking at the conversations that are happening, and they are obviously pretty good at picking up things that are getting momentum, or things that are pretty interesting, new proposals, or new companies that are building something new. They cover that in legacy media. They will never touch that unless these companies become public and or raise a bunch of money, or something like that. So, and that's okay. That's the flow. That's the information flow that goes between these like fragmented sets. They all have a connection to each other, but it's very fragmented. So it's not very easy to see if you're only visiting your timeline on X, or just visiting, or like typing coindesk.com on your browser and checking it out once in a while, or I don't know, seeing maybe some big influencer retweeting a video clip from CNBC about an interview that you might see. So that's why I created the perception platform as well, to just have everything in one place and to be able to see these straight lines, even though that line is going through a lot of fragmented sections of the overall discourse. So yeah, I think it's okay. I mean, I think that the Bitcoin framing in legacy media, like mainstream financial outlets, like I said, they see Bitcoin through a very specific lens that makes sense to them. So it's going to be price, volatility, and then how Bitcoin is somewhat related to like macroeconomic trends. And I think just this narrow focus has actually helped with institutional adoption. But obviously, it frames Bitcoin, narrowly as a speculative asset. But as the media landscape overall continues to keep fragmenting, I think these narratives will diverge, and some outlets will just double down on the Bitcoin is risky or Bitcoin is volatile storyline, to keep these legacy audiences engaged, and then others will evolve to reflect Bitcoin's expanding utility. Now, what these what these expanding utilities will be, time will tell, because a lot of interesting stuff are being built, and is going to be put to a test whether these things that are being built are actually being adopted, right? Like I talk, if I put on my Blockstream hat right now, this is what we are doing in Blockstream, right? Like we are building what we believe is the future on Bitcoin rails, and we are actively engaging people, prospects, to integrate our technologies, because we believe this is hyperbitcoinization looks a very certain way, and you need to build a lot of the a lot of the utility that you see in traditional finance. You need to build that on Bitcoin rail, but you got to make it better. So that's the bet, that's the risk, that's kind of like what we are building towards. And it's a nice, there's a nice relationship between adoption of new technology and the media who covers that technology and its users. So it's super interesting to be a marketer or communications person at Blockstream at this very moment as well, because you need to know the institutional lens. You need to understand why financial outlets are covering Bitcoin as NGU. You also need to understand the fragmentation effect, like how different audiences will see different narratives and be okay with that. And then you also need to understand like the inevitability of polarized Bitcoin narratives and why that's not necessarily bad.
Interesting. Because you brought it up, how do you think Hyperbitcoinization looks like? How do you see that? Does that mean that everyone is into Bitcoin? Like, is that a requirement for Hyperbitcoinization?
I think Hyperbitcoinization is kind of like hyper fiatization, where you just do stuff and you don't really know or understand how fiat money works. It's just the value that you're transmitting, and you have an understanding of that value, and you have no idea whether the institution that are lending you money or the corporations that are custody of your money, you don't understand. Like, I mean, 99% of people, Bitcoiners excluded, they have no idea about these things, right? Like, people still to this day, they go to the bank and they ask, "Hey, I want to take out $2,500." And they are shocked when they're like, "Oh, you can't do that." Or they say, well, "Okay, we can do it in 48 hours. You just need to fill 17 pages of paperwork first." They're shocked by that because they have no idea how the system works. And I think hyperbitcoinization is still going to offer the same things. There's still going to be lending. There's still going to be borrowing. There's still going to be private loans being issued. There's still going to be equities being issued and people buying stock into companies. So a lot of these financial instruments that have existed for a while, I don't think they're going to go away in a hyper-Bitcoinized future. The only difference is, which I think is the main difference, is Bitcoin is going to be the underlying technology. It's going to be the underlying protocol, and it's going to be the underlying assets. So if you get a fiat loan, the collateral is Bitcoin. I like that collateral way more than other types of collateral. So it's not about like breaking down the system. It's about just making it more efficient and improving on the things that needs to improve. And I think having the hardest money as the underlying asset, and that can also serve as the protocol, I mean, that's going to change the world, man. It's the same example that I talked about 10 minutes ago about one person being able to charge a service in Bitcoin, and just by the fact that this person is getting the hardest money ever, now has a chance to plan ahead and actually save in Bitcoin. That makes a huge difference. It's a simple transaction done on Bitcoin with Bitcoin, but it's so transformational just because of the nature, the properties of the asset and the properties of the protocol, that it's going to be life-changing. And I think the same thing when you scale up to, TradFi, legacy finance, just the fact that they integrate Bitcoin is going to make their services so much better and more efficient. So I think that's how hyper-Bitcoinization looks to me, at least.
It's super interesting. There are so many great narratives, and you just brought us a really, really good one. I like that narrative of the individual and what it brings him in the actual day-to-day life. Like not just like some numbers and like, oh, like your inflation and this and that. So like what actually does that mean? do you have, and maybe this is the narrative that you just brought to us, but do you have a personal favorite Bitcoin narrative that you're like, okay, if we all hammer that down, we'll come quicker to like Bitcoin hyper-Bitcoinization?
Yeah, I think honestly, I think we need to. If I had to choose one thing, and it's going to be a little bit biased because I I I I have been stacking Bitcoin since 2017, so I have a survivor bias. Right, it's not as easy to say what I'm about to say for someone who just entered and might go through a bear market in the next 6 to 12 months. Who knows? But savings, Bitcoin as savings technology, I think is the number one thing because um, the the concept of saving money is somewhat easy to understand. It's easy to understand why the money that you get today, you should not spend everything right away and try to save a portion of that every single day so you grow a bigger stack of money that you can then uh, use in the future for any choices that you want to make. So you are not forced to make any choice. It's a choice that is deliberate and voluntary because you have the power, you have the opportunity through savings to make choices and not let someone else make the choice for you. So I think that is way more. It's easier to teach than saying stuff about this is how peer-to-peer works. This is what decentralization means. Oh, this is SHA-256. This is base 58. Let me sit you down. Let's go and read the white paper together, and let's talk about cryptography and why that is important. Let's talk about mining and why mining is so important. I think just savings. Bitcoin is a hard asset because its circulation, new units being made every day is predictable. You already know what's going to happen. There's no central committee that are deciding, oh, today we're going to just print a 21 million today, and which in effect dilutes the value of the money that you're saving. So if we can get that, if we can get people to grok that, then that's a super important aspect, especially in Latin America or the global South or whatever you want to call it, the third world, where the concept of saving is almost non-existent because people are forced to just use all the money that they get in every day in order to cover basic needs. So in terms of like what is the easiest concept that also has the biggest transformational effect, I think Bitcoin as savings, cold storage, and just hold it, keep accumulating, and just do that for years. Is the one thing that will lead us the fastest to hyper-Bitcoinization. Everything else, and I'm sorry, but like how to run a node, how proof of work works, cryptography, all of that stuff is just not going to get people faster to having Bitcoin and believing in Bitcoin. So yeah, savings technology for the win.
Absolutely, I see that with the data on my YouTube analytics. Also, that's what people like to see and click on, especially when we look outside, because in the Western world sometimes it's almost seem outside of Bitcoin a little bit of a luxury good. Bitcoin, I hear that from my family. Oh, like you have to have a lot of money to get Bitcoin because like you have to have real estate and stocks, and only then you can also diversify in Bitcoin, which is a really weird narrative, but it definitely exists, and I see that a little bit less from people that come from Argentina, Latin America, Turkey, from other parts of the world where inflation is just a lot more crazy. How does it for you? How have you been? You've been born in Argentina, right? How long have you been in Argentina?
No, I mean, my mom immigrated when I was a kid, but I always went back to visit families. I've always maintained a good connection to Argentina. Yeah.
So how was growing up there with, and we had actually, I think, one or two podcasts, probably two podcasts, where we brought down and broke down how Argentina got a new currency, then this broke down, and a new currency, and then all those different iterations, like in a 1-2 hour video, really nicely. But it's really interesting to hear from you. How was it to see that firsthand? Because I only saw it from like other people explaining it to me.
Well, it kind of like accelerates a lot of bad decisions for the individual, because if you have any savings, if you have any assets, you are essentially being forced to sell them off in order to cover expenses. If you are a business owner, for example, and you need to pay people a salary, you can only raise your prices on the menu for that much before you completely lose your clientele. And you need to try to get cash flow from elsewhere in order to cover all business expenses. So in my particular situation, my dad, who used to, the height of his success, he had about 5 restaurants open at the same time, several cars and several properties. And you just sell one after one after one after one just to get cash flow to support all your costs to be in business. And then it goes to a point where, as hyperinflation accelerates, you accelerate the sell-off of these assets, and then you spend all the money that the selling of those assets gave you, and you ended up with nothing as hyperinflation continues from that point on. And then you're just like, okay, I got to close up. I can't maintain a business, and you're done. And that's just one example from my family. Imagine all business owners that had a business at any level, successful or not, during that time. And you didn't say the period for your podcast episode, but I can imagine this was the period after 1983 to 1989. Because in 1993, Argentina came out of a military dictatorship, or like democracy came back after 1976 to 1983 of being like a centralized authoritarian military dictatorship where you couldn't have elections. 83 came, and the new president, the new government, they kind of like wanted to change a lot of things. So they did, some very dubious, obviously in hindsight, very dubious choices, like moving the capital from Buenos Aires to a place called Viedma, and then changing the currency to something called Austral. They had no clue what they were doing, essentially. And after introducing that currency, you started to see 5,000 Austral bills, 10,000 bills, 20,000 bills. Kind of just kept adding zeros to those notes just to keep up with inflation, right? And it came to a point where that currency crashed. The capital was returned from Viedma to Buenos Aires. In that lapse of 1983 to 1989, those 6 years, can't even remember how many zeros we added to the currency, but just like a bunch. And 1989 was essentially the year that my mom chose to emigrate. So it was like she had enough, and at the very tail end, she decided to emigrate to Norway. Then in 1989, a new president came in, and he essentially converted back to the peso and had a policy that had some controlled inflation. At least it wasn't as rampant. And then they had a lot of reserve assets as well. And for the entire decade of the 90s, one Argentine peso was equivalent to $1 US. That stability just was enough for people to now be able to plan, go on vacation, enjoy life more, buy some assets. Just essentially, the middle class felt like a real middle class, and people had more purchasing power, and things were better. It was a better time looking back. But then, at the millennia, in 1999, 2000, and 2001, there's a lot of different crises in the world, and specifically in Mexico, there was a crisis called the tequila crisis, which was essentially a reserve currency crisis that started in Mexico and had like a ripple effect throughout Latin America that also broke this one-on-one peg down. And that kickstarted more inflation. People who had dollars saved in the bank, the bank essentially forced you to exchange those dollars into the local currency that was inflating away. So if you had let's say $10,000 in savings, you were forced to get it back in pesos, and then at the end of this whole process, it was maybe worth 3,000 US dollars. So again, once again, the Argentine people had to become the victim of this unfortunate monetary policies that continued, I would say, all the way to when Milei became president, because a part of just, bad market momentum or whatever you want to call it, there's also a cultural aspect when it comes to Argentina, where the political class, they use the money spigot to buy favors, to pay off people to not riot. It's a very antiquated model that is very resemblant to how Europe was in the 1920s, like right after the Industrial Revolution, with like the advent of unions, all these labor laws, and basically all these mafias, all these like groups that were like so-called in favor of the workers' interest, essentially created these scam, essentially these rackets, just to have power and to be aligned with politicians to remain in power. And that is mostly something that was perpetuated by the Peronism movement. And Peronism is, named after Perón, which was one of the most influential presidents in Argentine history. He was like a general, very right-wing military general who took a lot of the communist ideas and socialist ideas, kind of like made a very powerful package to essentially take power in the 1940s, all through the 70s. And his legacy is still perpetuated as an ideology by today's left wing of the Argentine government. And they just still use that formula: print a lot of money, pay off all these the syndicates and the unions, and then have like this like power vacuum that nobody else from the outside can really penetrate, because you just have to be an insider in order to enjoy the fruits of the power. And then until Milei came and kind of like broke that vacuum through the use of internet and the use of narratives, by becoming this like TV personality, this guy who was able to distill a lot of complex ideas like Austrian economics, who usually is a very academic thing. And that is, the reason why a lot of people don't really understand Austrian economics too much, because it's all a bunch of academia lingo that people don't really understand, right? Milei took all of that, took the ideas and distilled it. He synthesized it into a way that was very easy for people to understand, became viral. Internet fueled him to really spread the message, and eventually led him to be the president of Argentina. And in power, a year and a half later, has curbed inflation, right? So, well, that is Argentina in a nutshell. There's a big cultural problem that is underlying all like political flavors or political factions that gets created, and ideologies that keeps on living. But I'm very positive that Milei is able to at least change the cultural thing, because keeping up with a lot of political promises is difficult and takes a lot of time, because you have to do a lot of compromise, and you need to broker a lot of deals essentially. But culture is something that you can change today if you start with the narratives that are easy to digest and you just repeat them over time and you make sure that you have enough distribution, then, in a 4-year cycle, which is the cycle that he will be president, if he's able to turn the tide and actually have young people think in Austrian instead of thinking in socialist, then I think that's a huge improvement for Argentine society as a whole, because it starts with culture, it starts with narratives. Everything else is just downstream from the way you think and the way you see the world. So hopefully Milei is going to change that in the 3 years that he has left.
That's super interesting. So he has 3 years left, and he has been now 2 years in, 3 years in. What was?
Yeah. I mean, maybe a year and a half. So yeah, he has 2.5 years left, something like that.
Oh, okay, super interesting. Yeah, Milei is. I mean, he went through the phase of being extremely popular in the Bitcoin ecosystem, then with like some controversies. But I think at least I hope he really understands this free market dynamics and just wants to have a free competition between all currencies. And I think in any free competition around currencies and assets, Bitcoin will win. So for me, I like that approach. There's an argument to be made that approach is better than what the US is currently doing with buying Bitcoin for an individual person, because I personally like plebs and individuals have Bitcoin and not nation states. And I just want to have the nation state to make the rule that competition is possible and let the individual and free market decide what's best, because they know what's best. And I'm really looking forward to how Argentina is setting up in the next few years. Is setting up then with a new president potentially. I don't know if he can be reelected or he can. Okay, so hopefully he gets reelected. And if they continue this path, how does Argentina look like in 10, 20 years? They could potentially be a big country, a big one, and be a positive role model, positive example of how you get from bad to basically good with some radical changes. But it's not as easy. So I'm really looking forward if Argentina can be that example.
I mean, the arc of Argentina is from good to bad and then potentially good. So it's not going to be from bad to good, but you have to step back and see how Argentina was when Argentina, was really built, right? Like it's you have a parallel history here with the U.S. and Argentina in the sense of Europeans emigrating from Europe and going on boats and essentially going either to New York City or to Buenos Aires, right? And what's common for both countries at the same time is that these immigrants, they came with their families. They spent all their money on that one ticket, one way. There was no turning back, and people were determined to actually make whatever country they were going to great, right? They were opening businesses. If they didn't open businesses, they were working. They were helping other people build their businesses. And all of that had like a net positive effect because you essentially let the free market in. You are kind of like trying to sow things on very fertile land, but nothing is a guarantee. So you took a risk. But it essentially paid off because everybody was like in on it. It was like, here we are and we are here to build a nation type of mentality. And then, the US just became a success based on that mentality, and we're able to keep that mentality going. And you can maybe see now that idea of America being a little bit kind of like, watered out or kind of like breaking it a little bit into pieces, maybe. But in Argentina, it definitely broke into pieces. And that was a cultural phenomenon, right? That was a thing where all these, how can I say, all these ideas that the Europeans were escaping from, because they were escaping, the Spanish Civil War, World War I and II. There was like a lot of political instability in Europe at that time, right? Which led to poverty and impossible working environments that led them to leave. But all of that was because it was a big battle, a political, ideological battle between left and right. It was fascism versus communism. And unfortunately, the immigrants who came to Argentina and the US, they took that with them. And you had the same communist versus fascist battles in the US in the early 20th century in Argentina and the US. Now, what happened in Argentina is that the communists, the leftists with Perón, who had fascist tendencies, but it was more he was more communist in terms of being a very hardcore left-wing populist. Okay, he took over and laid the foundation for what you saw as the acceleration of the destruction of Argentina, which is you centralize power, you make the government as big as possible. The government has to have a part in everything that happens in the economy. And when the culture is rotten from within, that centralized power means, hey, if you want to do something, you got to pay me. If you want to open up a business, you have to pay me. If you want to have your business kept open, you got to pay me every month, every year, every whatever. It's a racket. It's exactly like the mafia. It's like Al Capone shit, just systemized in a government package. And that culture has led Argentina down to this path. So, hopefully Milei again can fix this, but it's just so much easier to destroy something than to build it. So we are looking at decades of destruction, and it's going to take double, triple the time to build it back. But you got to start somewhere, and hopefully Milei is the start of that.
I hope so too. And it's the time flew completely by. We're already at 1 hour and 10 minutes. Okay. That's fascinating. I have a bunch of more topics, but I think with the first round, we leave it at that. We have one question that I asked each and every one of my guests. And the question is, what can we learn from you besides Bitcoin?
Oh man, nothing. Don't listen to me. Don't believe anything I say. Make up your own mind about everything. But no, I think somebody like me, my experience in life is again, I've been working with disruptive technology. I've seen how technology can shape a whole society through cultural moments, through ease of use of things that just make your life easier. And if I say that the landscape today mirrors the music industry that I was part of when torrenting and streaming kind of like upended legacy power structures, believe me when I say that everything else is changing. It's not only about Bitcoin or anything like that. You will see so many institutions nowadays that are going to struggle to survive, and they are going to attempt to buy up the smaller, more agile players. And this is like from businesses to influencers to small outlets to everything. They're going to try to do that, but because they understand that they can't reverse the shift right now. Media outlets, financial companies, governments, politicians, they're all facing the same crisis now. They're losing control of narratives as independent creators and decentralized platforms and niche communities are like gaining power. The difference this time is that creators can now monetize directly using Bitcoin, but it's also so easy to do everything yourself with AI, with tools that really can do a lot of stuff for you as one person. And I think that the difference now is that those people who want to be bought up are not going to want to sell, because you can perfectly make $10,000 a month as a solo creator if you just figure out the variables where you have the combination of audience, distribution, and a very clear narrative that is a differentiator, and you solve a very important problem. And that is extremely exciting for the future, even though it can feel a little bit scary. But I think one thing to learn from me is be grateful that you're living in 2025 and are able to sit at the front row seat for everything that is going to change drastically in the next few years. So yeah, that would be it.
That's a great one, and I always say, what a time to be alive in 2025, and what a time to be alive in the forefront of the Bitcoin revolution. It's crazy that we have the privilege to do that. We have an end routine in the podcast where the previous guest is asking a question for the next guest without knowing who the next guest actually is, and the previous guest asked you the question: what's the biggest Bitcoin related mistake you have ever made?
Believing in spending Bitcoin instead of saving it.
Yeah. I guess I make that mistake, unfortunately, a lot because I'm 100% in Bitcoin.
Yeah, no, for sure. That is true. But as somebody from Argentina can tell you that everybody knows, if you live in a hyperinflationary environment, the money that you spend is the weakest. You spend that first. You don't spend the strongest. The strongest you save. And that is how the mind shift happens. You know, the weakest money is the one that gets distributed first. That's just how it is. And I think a lot of people, if they, me, myself included, I was paid in Bitcoin back in 2017, and I paid my rent for it and stuff like that. If I did not do that, I would be, in a better position today. So it's just save for the future, spend the weak money for now. That's it.
I love that. Really cool. Thank you so much, Fernando. Before I let you go, where can people find you, ask you questions, and reach out to you?
Just Google Fernando Nikolic. You'll find my Twitter, my X, all my stuff, my personal webpage, and check out BitcoinPerception.com if you want to get weekly, monthly reports on how the media, how communities like Reddit and X and influencers are covering Bitcoin and whether those trends that you discover are positive or negative, and follow that through. So BitcoinPerception.com.
Thank you so much for taking the time, and also thank you so much for everyone that is watching and listening, for joining us today. As always, I'll be back tomorrow with another episode. Bye-bye.